up, dads? Your boy Big Dave Martell back with another episode of Culture Dad's Age of Swords cassette. So today we have a really cool topic. We're going to talk about something that is absolutely just mountainous, just behemoth of artistic tradition in literature and beyond. Very, very influential in the lineage of literature and storytelling. And that is, we're going to talk about Gothic fiction or Gothic literature. And we're going to talk about all of the kind of the players, the big milestones in it, what it was about, all this kind of stuff, as well as some of the genres that branched off of it and all of its influence. So we're going to get into all of that. But speaking of Gothic, Mr. Mike and Imperium Press have a book coming out that have to do with Gothic literature and romance and art and everything like that. Mr. Mike, tell us about your book that's about to drop.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this one. It's called Blood, Soil, Paint. And it is by a gentleman by the name of Alexander Adams, who is he's an artist, like a visual artist, painter. He's also an art critic, a very, very knowledgeable guy on the history of art. And this book is about basically the intersection of the Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th century, along with nationalism and how it all ties together with art. So he goes into the history of like art and Romantic art, but not just visual art, although that is generally the focus. It's also, he talks about like Romantic literature, like Knut Hamsun and, many other artists and writers and everything, and how that intersected with like later nationalist movements, including the Italian fascists and the National Socialists in the 20th century. And basically what it's all about here is the intersection between blood, soil, and art and other things like culture and language and all these things, how they sort of create this like witch's brew of elements that just like that was this totally explosive, artistically, aesthetically explosive mix that just produced this like efflorescence of culture and beauty and sublimity and all this amazing stuff. And it's got lots of color paintings in it and everything like that. And like I say, Alexander Adams is a super knowledgeable guy about this stuff. He's probably, I don't want to say he's the premier art critic in our sphere because, our man, Giant Geo is also on that tip as well. We've got quite a few guys that are qualified to talk about this. Adams is definitely one of them. So this will be a very interesting book. I spoke with him and Academic Agent on AA's channel a little while ago, basically talking a little bit about like modernist art and how modernism is actually something that has significant right-wing currents. So yeah, very interesting dude, very interesting book. It's going to be out probably a week or two after this episode drops, but there's a lot of intersection about what he's talking about in there and what we're going to talk about tonight, which is, of course, Gothic literature, classic horror, and the intersection between that and what was going on in the 19th century, including nationalism and Romanticism and all that. So this is an opportune moment to talk about the book. But anyway, so we're going to talk about the history of Gothic literature as a kind of framework, and then we'll branch out, talk about all of the movements that were sort of swirling around at the time. So, Dave, do you want to take us through maybe where this all started?
Yes. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where it started. If you go to like a literature department in a university, they're going to say it started with Mary Shelley. However, this is not true. They kind of like, give her the hat of creator of Gothic fiction and sci-fi and all of these kinds of things. And that's just not the case. There were several authors that predate her that, she would have known about, obviously, to write this kind of stuff. You have the kind of the furthest back fiction well, I guess you could call this weird fiction, or this gets pinned as science fiction sometimes. When talking about these really early classic genres, these types of works existed before the genres that we have today. For example, the like Bram Stoker and the authors we're going to talk about didn't even have this word Gothic, and they didn't even have this word horror. They simply called themselves supernatural literature or something like romance or something like this. They didn't have the genre descriptors that we have, and a lot of this stuff was very genre blending. They didn't have the confines of genres that we do today. Like they didn't have a specific folk horror. They didn't have cosmic horror. They didn't have this horror, that horror, or this romance, or that fantasy, or this or that. They didn't have these things. They just wrote weird fiction, supernatural fiction, etc. Right? And I don't even think they called it fiction. They just said literature. Because back in these days, there was a distinction between what was like what they called a romance or a Roman, which is a word for a novel, and then something that's more, I guess, academic. There was a distinction. However, it wasn't this black and white separation. Most guys that were intellectual wrote both, right? A lot of guys that wrote about philosophy also wrote fiction, also wrote poetry, and they all kind of hung out together in this kind of blending big brain, these friend groups. So if we want to pin down where Gothic horror started, you can start in the 1600s with a book called The Chemical Wedding. It was in 1616, or at least it was printed in 1616. Nobody's really sure when it came out. The author was named Johann Valentin Andrea. I've actually tried to read this. It's a little bit of a tough read. It's really, really archaic. It's not a fiction story as what we would understand it to be. However, this has romance elements in it. It has sublimity, right? I like efflorescent sublimity. Mike has his romantic Gothic words loaded up because he just got done reading Arthur Machen, right? So
that's right. Yeah. I just loaded up on that shit today. I read 2 novellas in one day, so all of that shit is just like, it's just this tornado that's kind of like churning in my brain right now. Yes. We'll get the flowery language out and just like not be in the second half or something. I don't know. Not to say that these guys are they were awesome writers, actually, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about their like linguistic superiority at some stage. But anyway, continue on.
So the term Gothic actually gets used in like the very first Gothic book, which is the Castle of Otranto or Otranto. I don't know how to pronounce it. Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. Yeah, Horace Walpole in what year was that? 1760 or something like that. I don't know. So the middle of the 1700s is when the first Gothic story comes out, and the Castle of Otranto. It's called Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story, and this is a romance with spooky stuff involved. It's got the supernatural involved. So it's got architecture, it's got the sublime, it's got many of the elements that we now identify as Gothic, and this becomes the blueprint moving on for what is the mood and the aesthetic of Gothic storytelling, right? I've never actually finished it. I have the PDF. I've tried to read it in the past. It's, I will read it one day because it is such a milestone in history, but it's out there, and a lot of folks say it still holds up. It's still a very good book, even though it was written in the 1750s. But this is where Gothic horror starts. Is Horace Walpole, The Castle of Otranto.
Right. Yeah. No, I've not read this myself either. But I just wanted to comment on something that you mentioned that I thought was quite interesting. When a genre is kind of born as first of all, I'll say something about the Castle of Otranto. One of the things that is kind of interesting about it is it's the first, and this is why it really gets billed as the Gothic novel, like the sort of big bang of Gothic horror, Gothic literature, is because it's the first book to actually like just bill itself as a Gothic story, right? That was the subtitle. It mentioned like, a Gothic story, so on and so forth. But interestingly, at this time in the 1760s, I think it was 1764 that it was published, the term Gothic did not have the kind of connotations that it has right now for us, right? Like spooky stuff and Dracula and vampires and all that. Of course, it didn't, because those came later, as this book was kind of the beginning of. But what it meant at the time really was just medieval. And this book and part of the reason why it reads so archaically is that that the author intended for it to be a kind of, it was supposed to be like a lost manuscript from the medieval period that had been rediscovered. Like this is part of like the book's like frame story or whatever, is that it was like a rediscovered manuscript from like olden times and so on and so forth. So when he says it's a Gothic story, what he means is it's a medieval story. So that's all it really means in this context. And of course it took on the connotations of, the aesthetic, that the book itself contained, with like, spooky stuff and like moving walls and like old castles and ruins and sort of like dark night-like imagery and things like that. But originally it actually just was supposed to be like an ancient story or like a medieval story, which, for people in this time, this is right kind of around the Enlightenment era. I mean, what medieval meant was it mean dark and benighted and like weird, torturous things going on and kind of barbarism and retardation and things like that. So this was kind of what the story was intended to convey with that word. So yeah, it's just interesting how words kind of change over time in that respect. And also, I wanted to comment on that you mentioned how this early sort of incarnation of like horror or Gothic horror. Of course, horror itself did not exist as a genre at this stage. That the early examples of it are kind of like genre bending, like these proto-Gothic like things, or like novels and whatnot. The novel was a new form at this stage, but the Gothic novel itself, of course, any time that something like a new genre is kind of born, it's going to be like this unclassifiable weird thing. It's kind of like, the Castle of Otranto is to Gothic fiction as something like Blue Cheer is to like heavy metal or whatever. It's not quite metal, but it's definitely like on the way to it, or it is to Gothic fiction as MC5 is to punk. Like MC5 is not a punk band, but they were definitely like a watershed. They were a turning point towards that genre kind of thing. And this book is as well. I think you could talk about other, maybe even earlier examples. Like for me, Macbeth really checks almost all the boxes in terms of Gothic fiction. It's dark. It's got spooky shit going on. It's about the past sort of coming back to haunt the present. There's maybe not as much in the way of sublimity. I think the Sublime, which we'll talk a bit more about, is really a key aspect of the Gothic genre. But you could perhaps argue that there is something of that in Macbeth, but there are of course precursors to it. But as a genre, it kind of didn't get going until really the late 18th century, like late 1700s, early 1800s. And of course, Dave, you mentioned Frankenstein as another important watershed moment there. Anyway, so continue on with the history. You're the guy that usually gives us the history, so continue on.
Well, in Castle of Otranto, he actually, I don't know if it's in the preface or if he said this, but Horace Walpole actually directly cites Shakespeare as his main influence for this. So Shakespeare directly informs Castle of Otranto. This is the lineage is right there. So you're absolutely right. If you want to go back to like the first Gothic or the first horror or the first supernatural or the first weird, you might have to go to Shakespeare. He might be the actual sire of this. And I know Poe mentions him and Lovecraft mentions him, and pretty much all of the guys mention him, right? So you can't really go into Gothic horror or horror in general without Shakespeare being mentioned. He is certainly an inspiration for not just horror, but also fantasy and all kinds of other things as well. He is a really strong pinpoint for where this all begins. However, moving on after Castle of Otranto, you get quite a few other novels that come out. I'm not really sure exactly where in the timeline, but Gothic horror becomes codified. You get this defined genre that a lot of these authors kind of fall into at this point. You have if we talk about Gothic horror, Gothic literature, there are a few things that define it. So if you read something, you can say this is Gothic. First of all, you mentioned the Sublime. Second, you have architecture. Third, you have a lot of it had to do with morality. There's a lot of metaphors of philosophy and morality, and kind of this. There at this period of time, you have this argument going back and forth between Enlightenment ideas and old time ideas of Protestant morality and Protestant everything. This is the time that Charles Darwin comes out, right? You have was that the Evolution of Species, and then also he wrote the book Descent of Man. And you have to understand at this point, this kind of thing evolution wasn't even on people's minds. It was actually pretty shocking and ghastly to tell people at this period in time that they descended from apes, right? This freaked them out. And you see this influence on a lot of the Gothic fiction. For example, Jekyll and Hyde, The Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde. You see Hyde being this kind of monkey man, almost this primitive monkey man, this criminal, this weird guy, and then it's in juxtaposition to this high-minded thing. There's a lot of metaphors going on with it. It's also about kind of like the inner beast in man, what's behind. It's a critique of the social classes sort of during this time, and some corruption, and there's a lot going on with it. But there's a lot of elements that go into what defines this, but defines this genre. But the Sublime is one, romance is another. When I say romance, I don't necessarily mean falling in love. It can be that, but romance is much more than that. Romance is effectively like a narrative for characters. Like for example, if you go a little bit further on, a lot of early science fiction are called planetary romances. Like, for example, Star Wars would be considered a planetary romance. It's there's falling in love is in there. There is romantic interests. Guys and girls fall in love in there, but that's not the overarching theme. It is a grand narrative, and this is what romance means. So this is a fundamental element of Gothic fiction, is you have these characters that have turmoil, emotional turmoil, and a lot of these these kind of narrative aspects of character development and their interaction with other characters and how they deal with certain things, overcoming certain things. Like, for example, one of the big, probably the big daddy of Gothic fiction in my mind is Bram Stoker's Dracula. That's not his first book, and some people argue that it's not even his best book, but it's probably his most influential book. It's so influential that people actually literally believe that Dracula was real and that Dracula went to that island in Great Britain and murdered people. There's people that go there on vacation, like expecting to see where the graves of the people that Dracula murdered. That's real. Like, this is how powerful some of this fiction is, that it gets blended so much into our memory that it becomes myth and people think that it's real. You know what I mean? So the Big Daddy is Bram Stoker's Dracula in my mind, and it has all of the elements. It has Dracula, who is a manifestation of evil. He is a representative. He is an archetype of sexual deviancy, of sin, of greed, of all of the things that, from a Protestant worldview, is like the ultimate evil. He is the ultimate evil in this manifest, and the protagonist has to deal with this. Dracula is almost a stand-in for the main character overcoming his own sin and the temptations of the devil and all of these kinds of things. It has a grand spooky castle. Architecture is a huge part of Gothic literature. As Mike mentioned, Gothic in its original form was just referencing the medieval. And because of this, there's always castles, there's always old buildings, there's always towers and things made out of block and stone and so on and so forth. It's always there's always a lot of emphasis on the atmosphere. Atmosphere is a huge part of this. Stormy nights and nighttime and howling winds and all of the above, fog, spooky fog. There's a lot that goes into the atmosphere of Gothic horror. So you go to these old places, these old buildings, these castles, and it's a dark night, and there's rain coming down, and the lightning splits the sky and flashes in sinister ways. And you go in and you meet these mysterious, strange creatures of the night that masquerade as in human form. And this is Gothic literature. And then overall, it is romantic. And not just romantic in a narrative sense, but romantic in a philosophical way as well. It has that passion. It has that efflorescence, right? It has the sublime. This is a big part. So I've been yakking for a little bit. Mr. Mike, you want to talk about what the sublime means? Because it's very important.
Sure. Yeah. We could definitely talk about that, because that's an important part of it. That might be the key aspect, really, of the Gothic, which might be a bit of a obscure take, but I think that it's defensible. Basically, what the Sublime is fundamentally, the Sublime basically is that combination of not just awe, but also terror. So the Sublime is, terror is just like, I don't know, something like a serial killer or something like that. It's on the loose. Somebody breaks into your house and like you're fearing for your life or whatever. That's terror. The Sublime is something like that, but also that just has this awe and majesty about it. So the Sublime would be like, you hear this kind of rumbling sound, and then you look up on the mountain and you see an avalanche bearing down on you. And there is absolutely nothing at all that you can do to get away from it. You're just going to get crushed by it. So you just look up at it and you feel a kind of fear, but you also feel that awesome power of it. You know that you're going to get just obliterated by it. You feel the sublimity of nature in that moment. That would be like the Sublime kind of thing. And this is also something that is important it's an important element of the Gothic as well. You see this with, you see it in something like, Frankenstein, where it's the awesome and terrible power that science can wield in essentially what amounts to the, proto-transhumanism or something kind of like that. You also see this in something like Dracula as well, where, what makes Dracula terrifying isn't just that he's going to suck your blood or whatever. What makes Dracula terrifying is that he's like 800 years old. you're not going to be able to outsmart this guy. You're not going to be able to get away from him. He's impossibly smarter than you. He's impossibly stronger than you. He's impossibly more charismatic than you. There's just nothing you can do. He's like a force of nature that comes from the outside. And what's interesting about Dracula as a character is that he really does kind of embody this outsideness, that he's from a different place. He is a like radically different order of creature, like of living being, or undead being, I guess, shall we say. What's hilarious about this is that like literary studies focusing on Dracula often make a big deal out of this, about how he is kind of the villain aspect of Dracula is all bound up with him being the Xenos. It's a tale of xenophobia, Dave. You know what I mean? It's about fear. Yeah, it goes into all this gay shit or whatever. But there is kind of something to it. There is an outsideness about Dracula that makes him terrible and terrifying, but he's also has that awesome power that is just irresistible, and that's where the sublimity kind of comes into it. And you can look at this, you could see this in many other of the of the Gothic fiction examples, and where this kind of I think what makes this interesting and where it situates the Gothic historically is that, you know, Castle of Otranto is written and published in the 1860s. This is sort of where the Enlightenment is kind of coming into its own. It kind of really hits its stride in the late 18th century. And then something else comes along sort of as a counter current to that. And what comes along in kind of somewhat in opposition, mainly in opposition to the Enlightenment, is of course Romanticism. And I think that there's an important connection there, an important connection between Romanticism and the Gothic, and that also sort of lands on what we're talking about with the Sublime. So Romanticism is the break with the neoclassical, as we talked about in our Romanticism in the Volksgeist episode. And there's an aesthetic move away from veneration of the beautiful, which is what neoclassicism was about, to veneration of the sublime, right? This kind of awe and terror mixture, this kind of ambiguous, like you love it, but you also are just like absolutely just completely terrified of it. It's always the sublime is always oriented towards what can destroy us. And if you look at this, you'll see this in the book in Blood, Soil, Paint, that a lot of what is depicted in like visual art of the Romantic period is these massive sort of, you know, you get a lot of like natural vistas and like impossibly massive things that are kind of depicted, that you get these like seascapes, or, you know, the I forget, Caspar David Friedrich with the guy, everybody knows this painting of the guy, the wanderer, that's like just poised above the precipice. You get all these epic kind of situations and depictions of aesthetic grandeur and sublimity, right? Like this is an important part of the Romantic aesthetic. Another important connection with Romanticism that is also seen in the Gothic is that Romanticism is obsessed with the primitive. It's obsessed with the savage, what is native to the land, you know, that it's situated in, and what's primitive, right? The Gothic too is always oriented towards the past, and it's usually oriented towards the pre-classical past, like the archaic, right? And Gothic fiction is very often about wild, unhinged forces breaking loose, right? Like, you know, very often it's supernatural, but sometimes, especially in like the later Gothic fiction, especially when you're talking about things like Southern Gothic that don't have as much supernaturalness to them, it's the like wild, unhinged forces just within the characters that are breaking loose. So this aspect of the primitive, this is important to the Gothic. Very often what happens in a Gothic novel or a Gothic story is that the past comes back to haunt the present. And this is kind of something that you see in Romanticism as well, in the visual art, in the literature, and in all aspects of it as well. And the last thing I think that is important to point out in the connection with Romanticism is that in Gothic art, very often the scenery, this may sound like something that's prosaic, but the scenery is very important. It's very well depicted, and it's set up. Like, what do we think of when we think of Gothic fiction? We think of it was a dark and stormy night or something kind of like that. Like, that's a bit of a meme even. But you think of Gothic fiction, and what do you think of? Maybe it's probably not a character. You think of a ruined castle. You think of a sort of like dark, headland with a castle jutting out of it, and sort of at dusk or something. You think of lightning flashing across the sky at night or whatever. You think of all these visual aspects. You think of the scenery. There's tremendous care given to scenic description and atmosphere in the Gothic novel, in Gothic stories, just as there is in Romanticism. A lot of Romantic art is just kind of like it's depicting nature kind of in its like wild, untamed bruteness. So I think that it's you almost can't even understand the Gothic without really thinking of it as an outgrowth of this Romanticism. So that I think is the connection with the Sublime. That's kind of where the two kind of intersect, and it's a very important aspect of both.
And I will extrapolate. When Mike says terror, he doesn't necessarily mean just like fear, like you see something, oh my God, this is so scary, I need to run away. It is that, but not necessarily from an evil force. When we talk about Sublime aesthetically, it is it is greatness, right? Something that is so monumentally huge. It is irresistible, or it's undefeatable, or it's insurmountable. Something. And it doesn't even have to be a character. It could be an idea, or it could be just like something that is of a spiritual quality or metaphysical quality. It is something that is like great and immeasurable. It's something that is beyond, right? Like you mentioned, outsideness. And Dracula, the way you described Dracula was perfect. He is the Sublime, right? And the Lovecraftians out there, they're gonna know exactly now what I'm talking about, right? Lovecraft, like he took this to the next level with the Sublime to create his cosmic horror stuff. And this is a kind of this cosmicism really is is sublimity 2.0, right? This idea of something that is outside or within reality that is so big and so insurmountable you can't do anything about it. You're just in awe. And you see this. Another thing about Dracula is Dracula was not the first vampire. Vampires were very popular this time, and vampires stayed a popular character and stand-in and archetype for a long time. But before this, the vampire was pretty much just viewed as this kind of like undead, mindless, bloodthirsty, flesh-eating creature. The archetype of Dracula, the aristocratic vampire, appears in John William Polidori's The Vampire. It's spelled with a Y. This was the first time that we see the aristocratic. This is where the Sublime gets applied to him. It gets applied to the vampire, and he becomes this intellectual superhuman, right? He's born of the devil, but he is also a superhuman that you can't do anything about. And it also appears in Carmilla, which is a story that came out in 1870 by Sheridan Le Fanu. This is one that's a very, very influential as well. Carmilla is a vampiress, and she is sublime in a way that she's an otherworldly beauty that you cannot resist. And this was a big part of of the like kind of the Protestant morality bleeding into this, because Carmilla, she is like the ultimate manifestation of temptation. She is so beautiful and seductive that men are powerless to her, right? If you see her, you will be awestruck by her beauty, because her beauty was so great it doesn't really exist on Earth. And there's quite a few others at this time. And so here's a book that I want to mention that is very strongly in the Gothic time. It was pretty influential for its time. It was a romantic work, but it sort of gets a bad rap now because it is championed by degenerates and leftoids now. And I'm talking about The Monk, a romance by Matthew Gregory Lewis, who was a guy that was on the Parliament. He was a politician. He was a respected guy. He was a very smart guy. Although everybody back then was very smart. But The Monk, a romance, gets lifted up by leftoids because back in those days it was Romanticism was very Odinic. Right. It was very much about the uncaged forces of nature and the uncaged like vitalist parts of humanity kind of breaking out. And this book was somewhat of a subversion of like Victorian Protestant ethics. There's like a lesbian love thing in there. There's a lot of debauchery. It was an extremely controversial story back then, and leftoids now because of everything that's in it. I don't really think that the guy was a degenerate like that. I think that he could have been. I haven't done the research into it. So those of you guys that are more familiar with the book, maybe, you can clarify on this. However, from the way that you read the book, it's actually not that, it's not as smutty as you would think it is. Obviously it's written in the 1700s. You can't, I don't think much anything written back then.
How smutty can it be, really?
Yeah, exactly. He was throwing a punch at the prim and proper, buttoned up Protestant morality of the time, and he was, in my summation, he was probably just writing some bro shit. He's like, let's get the girls to kiss. You know what I mean? Like, I remember, when I was a kid, like I didn't even understand, homosexualism or anything like that. But I was like, oh man, the girls are kissing. You know what I mean? So it was a very risque book that he wrote, The Monk, a romance. So and it also the main protagonist is a monk, is a Christian monk, and he does some scumbag shit. Like he does. Yeah, you gotta read the book, but this was an important marker too, because this was where things like lust and carnal urge and carnal thirst and these kinds of very sexy, risque things got introduced into Gothic horror, because and this is also the connection between sex and horror happen. It doesn't matter if you're reading a Gothic horror or if you turn on an 80s horror or if you turn on a horror today. It's just notorious. Any horror during the 80s, there's a sex scene with teenagers and before they get murdered. There's a monster that shows up where the girl's taking a shower and she's got her tits out. Like nudity and sex and lust and these types of things are involved with horror for some reason. It's probably because the part of your brain that experiences fear is also the part of your brain that experiences lust. I don't know why, but you go read the old pulps. There's some scantily clad woman with her boobies popping out and some monster chasing her, ripping her dress off. It's like it's just woven together. You can't get away from it. Like sex and horror are married, and it looks I think that it starts here, and it probably just is in there, but this guy knew it. So and I don't think those things should be divorced. I think that's an important aspect of it, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's something very primitive going on with that, where I don't know what to make of it, really. It would be a good topic for investigation. I'm sure it's been investigated by Freudians and later on, degenerates in academia. And I don't really want to know anything about that. But I'm sure that there is some sort of interesting connection between them, between sex and fear or lust. But yeah, it's interesting that the Gothic genre very often it is like this, and this is kind of like part of what the Romantic movement was also doing in some ways, where it was there, kind of trying to shock people out of complacency, like Arthur Machen in his Great God Pan, which is maybe my favorite like horror or Gothic horror story, which you can get in the Masters of Horror Volume 1, I believe, at the Bizarre Archives.
Yep.
This book actually hurt Arthur Machen's his reputation as a novelist, as a writer, because it was scandalous. If you read it, I mean, okay, it was written or published in 1894, right? So at this time, I mean, again, how smutty is it going to be? It's not at all. Basically, there is nothing explicit whatsoever in this book, but there is a lot of sex implied, right? Like the main antagonist, I don't know what you could call her, but basically the girl in the story that is kind of like doing racy stuff in the woods is like, it's never described and it's always just kind of implied. And apparently, spoiler alert, the god Pan fathers a child on this one girl that like ends up becoming this like the main female character in the story. But like all that stuff is like not at all described. It's just kind of like Machen is a master at leaving things unsaid and implying them in ways that are A, terrifying, and B, very subtle. So like he doesn't have to describe any of the stuff that goes on, but what happened, kind of thing, and how to feel about it. You know why it's so terrifying and everything. He really truly is a master of horror. This is something that modern horror writers, like, they should be reading this and taking notes. Anyway, the point I'm driving at here, though, is that it was a scandalous story, and it actually harmed his reputation because it was considered too racy at the time. There's something about the Gothic genre that just does that. That is kind of baked into the formula of the Gothic novel and Gothic fiction more broadly, is that it's kind of like it is there to upset Puritan sensibilities and everything like that. And I mean, that's kind of like cool. I like it. I like it too, especially because like the Puritan sensibilities of today are, it's everything that we hate, basically. It's like wokeness and sort of like it's the bug man that's like this hyper moral that's just wagging his finger at you for just being fucking normal. You know what I mean? So like it's in a sense, okay, yeah, like you're talking about this book back in the late 18th century, where the left is sort of like looking at it, be like, oh yeah, like offending the Puritans or whatever. But like, really, that's kind of what we're doing now. Really, it's more kind of along, we kind of own that more than they do, because they are basically the Puritan church ladies of today. But anyway, I just find it interesting that Gothic horror and Gothic fiction more broadly is kind of like, it's there to kind of offend these things. It kind of is very Odinic, as you mentioned. It's there to push boundaries. It's there to sort of make you, it's there to be a little bit uncanny, to transcend the, to transgress a little bit against the morality of its time, to kind of stand outside of the bounds, beyond the pale a little bit, and be a little bit uncanny. This is part of what it's doing, and I think this is also part of what we like. I mean, like, if in the radical right, the reason why, I mean, I've been watching a lot of this guy named Gypsy Crusader recently. Do you know who he is, Dave?
I've heard of him.
All right. So, I mean, he's basically this guy that goes on this social media site called Omegle, which is, for people who don't know what Omegle is, it just like pairs you with like random strangers and like just lets you talk to them until you're tired of them, and then you click okay, next person or whatever. It's almost like speed dating, but like for conversation instead. And he's like this, like he's this Nazi guy that's like just goes all around and basically abuses people. It's actually kind of like it's too fucking much. But you know what's interesting is that like I heard him like have this like conversation with like this one kid who had been about like 15 or whatever, and the kid was like basically saying like the guy's Gypsy Crusader's like, what do you think about Hitler? He's just like he always like he'll like land on this like conversation like in the first question 1 second after like, you know, coming onto this other person's screen will be like, white power for you? Or like, you know, it's just like, he just like goes straight into it. You know what I mean? It's just hilarious. But anyway, he was talking to this 15-year-old kid, and, you know, after a minute or so, he's like, so what do you think about Hitler? And the kid's like, well, I joke around about him a lot. You know, we always make Hitler jokes at school and things like that. But I don't know if I really am down with it or whatever. But the reason why I bring this up is that this is kind of a thing now. I mean, for like Zoomers and like kids who are even younger, perhaps, Hitler is kind of this thing that's just, it's so fucking far beyond the pale that it almost like makes you giddy. Like they love joking about it, and it's like it's just this thing that's there to like offend your mom and shit. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of what it is for these people. It's there to push the boundaries. It's there to stick out and be a little bit uncanny and just like, whoa, that's too far, bro, or whatever, which is hilarious. I used to do the same shit to my parents. I used to do the same shit back in the 90s and 2000s and stuff to people, right? Like just to troll them. And in some sense, this is what the Odinic is doing more broadly. It's there to kind of step over the line and to push it further beyond where it's supposed to go. And in some sense, in a much more restrained sense, in a much more aristocratic sense, this is kind of what Gothic fiction is doing. It's pushing those boundaries and going there where you're not supposed to go.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned, dude, Arthur Machen. If you guys listen, if you've not read Arthur Machen, you got to change that. This guy is so fucking good, man. He's so good. One of the greatest of all time. Like Lovecraft said that, Lovecraft, fawned over this guy, said he's like the greatest of all time. And if you read Machen and you go read Lovecraft, it's like Lovecraft literally just like grabbed a lot. He even just like grabbed words that he used and reused them. Like it's like he's like the blueprint of the Wyrd and stuff like that. He's the kind of guy that you read his books and you immersed. And the big thing about Romanticism was the immersion. That's one of the key elements of romantic fiction in general, is it immerses you in this thing, and you don't have a choice. It like thrusts you into a fantasy, and you can't escape. And he was just a master at this. And you'll be sucked into one of his stories and reading it, and you'll completely just block out the rest. And somebody will come tap your shoulder, and it's really spooky. It's still spooky to this day. Arthur Machen, he was, as we mentioned before, he was kind of on this precipice. It is Gothic. He also coined and started folk horror, and he was also one of the guys that led up to what we understand to be weird fiction, which is very interesting. Is it a very interesting timeline when we talk about weird fiction? Is because a lot of times you get an art form, it gets codified, and it gets codified to the point that it splinters all these millions of different genres and everything until you don't even know what the fuck it is anymore, and it kind of loses its flavor, and then it gets ripped back down into something more primitive, right? Something that's a little bit more fluid. And this what happened with weird fiction is it started to get codified, and then it just got blown apart again into something even more nebulous, right? And this was like Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood and W.W. Jacobs and Ambrose Bierce and William Hope Hodgson. These guys that were sort of just considered supernatural literature at this point. They were called Gothics or supernatural writers. Started this. They took Gothic horror, what was with the castles and everything, and they took it to the next level. And they added in even more metaphysical elements and more of the sublime and more of raw nature and the chaos that can be involved with raw nature. And philosophically, nature is not chaos, nature is order. But you know what I'm saying, from like the woods and everything, like what spooky, weird, ancient shit. And it is that there's this ongoing theme that gets started from Gothic and goes on forever. And obviously Poe is in there. You can't even talk about this genre without Poe. I know I guess it's kind of cliche and everybody knows Poe, but dude, Poe is such a giant with what he wrote, the stuff that he wrote, that you can't not mention him. And what these guys, a recurring theme in all of this is that which is from the past will come back to fight the present. It will collide with the present, and that which is from the past is sublime, and it may be greater and superior, more noble, or it may be more powerful, and there's nothing you can do about it. So there's this sublimity applied to that which comes from the past and which lurks, that still survives from the past. It's so there's this theme that which is in the past is more powerful than the present, and that is in all of this fiction going forward and going into like even into the weird and everything like that. So Gothic horror laid the foundations for pretty much how we write fiction today. You can't have modern fiction, whether you're talking fantasy, whether you're talking horror itself, whether you're talking science fiction. You can't have any of it without Gothic horror. And obviously another one we kind of brushed over was Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I think Mary Shelley gets jerked off a lot because she was like one of a very early woman writer. But here's the thing, there were other women writers back then. In the Victorian era, women were expected. Like, it was not like you weren't some rebellious girl boss if you were an author. Writing and being an author was a luxury of the higher classes, and there were a lot of women in the higher classes. Radcliffe comes to mind. Radcliffe was extremely popular back then. She was a woman. Mary Shelley was not this feminist icon. She was a woman that was born to privilege. She had a very wealthy, influential father. She married up, and then she married up again. She was classically, she was educated by a duchess, like tutored personally by a duchess. She was not she was not this like revolutionary feminist icon. She was a very brilliant woman and was a very gifted writer and wrote a very influential story. But her being painted as this revolutionary feminist icon to paint it, it's not accurate. It's the retconning of history.
Yeah, definitely. I honestly have never really found Frankenstein to be to my taste, but everybody's different. Another woman we could mention here in the connection with the Gothic genre is Emily Brontë with Wuthering Heights. This book also has a lot of Gothic elements in it. It's got kind of like some supernatural and like ghost-like elements. It's definitely like dark and weird, and I don't know how much sublimity you could really talk about there, but there's sort of like, things from the past coming back to haunt the present. It is very... It definitely deserves to be mentioned, and it's a classic too. It deserves to be mentioned as a, at least Gothic adjacent, if not actually full on Gothic. Maybe it is. I'm not sure. But for my money, the genre really gets interesting kind of in the late 19th century, after about 1870 or 1880. That's when you get things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That's when you get Arthur Machen. That's when you get Dracula. I mean, Dracula, we think of the Gothic as something that's starting in 1760s. Dracula was published in 1897, almost in the 20th century.
Yeah,
it's very late. Yeah, exactly. So for my money, this is when things really start to get interesting. And I think what we could kind of one of the influences that was kind of moving things in this direction, where the turn came from in part, but in large part, I think, was from what Dave mentioned earlier, which was Darwin's Origin of Species, where up until this point, not in scientific circles, but certainly in layman terms or in the popular imagination, the primitive history of mankind was conceived of in theological terms. When Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, this was a grenade that went off in the consciousness of the West.
An atomic bomb.
It was like, this might be the most important book that was published in the millennium from 1000 AD to 2000. It's like, it did so many things that we're still we're still early in the post-Darwin era. You know what I mean? It disenchanted the world in a way that we're still coming to grips with. It allowed us to understand ourselves in radically different ways. I have argued, I guess I haven't actually really said much about it publicly, but I believe that natural selection is a metaphysical principle. It's not just something that tells us about how we came to be who we are. That natural selection is something that operates on traditions. It's something that operates at the subatomic level. It really is a metaphysical principle. It's a very deep principle. This is an important book. Everybody knows it's an important book. How could you not? But anyway, it also influenced the Gothic genre as well, because before this, we're thinking of the past as coming back to haunt the present as something more historical in nature. Whereas after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, the primitive and the archaic, let's just say that the time span got expanded by many, many, many orders of magnitude back, right? Now, instead of talking about 6,000 years of history, we're talking about something on the order of millions and billions of years of prehistory, right? There's a lot of past to come back now to haunt the present. And so you get this turn towards, it's still supernatural. It's still quasi-religious. It's still metaphysical and everything like that. But you get a much more hard science kind of turn towards the Gothic, and especially when things like, Jekyll and Hyde and even Dracula and things like that. There's a very much more kind of hard-nosed, realist attitude or orientation that you get in the Gothic in the latter half of the 19th century. I think some of it comes down to the Darwin, that sort of changed the trajectory. It's moving us more towards things like Lovecraft, more towards things like Algernon Blackwood with his book The Willows, which is also, you can get that as well on the Bizarre Archives. I just read that for the first time today, and it was very interesting. This is quite an interesting story. I'm interested to get your take on it too, Dave. But for my money, this was a book where it almost is a kind of it's a one of a kind. It's kind of strange, actually. Of course, it's strange, but it is very much like sui generis, where it really is just kind of like cut from its own mold. Where so much of this book is really just like scenery description. I mentioned before the importance of scenery and the natural to the Gothic genre. I mean, like, I would say like a good 50% of the book is just scenic description, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
but it's awesome. It really, and it's cool because it kind of like starts with a lot of that in the first half, and then it slowly builds into this crescendo of like it you know, it certainly does have a plot and everything, and that kind of like starts to snowball about, you know, a quarter of the way through, and it just kind of picks up the pace as it goes along. And it's really, but the plot is like kind of there's not a lot of stuff that happens. A lot of what's going on is going on internally within the characters. It's a lot of it is very psychological. It's a highly psychological story, and in some sense, and this is even more so in Machen's Great God Pan, this kind of a mystery story too. There's a kind of weird crossover going on, especially with the later Gothic stuff and mystery novels, where you're kind of like trying to unravel what happened. Or what is currently going on, because it's not clear. But you can definitely, with Blackwood's The Willows, you can really see the influence on Lovecraft. Something is coming from outside of the normal order of reality that's impinging on the characters, who are just kind of like, they're in this, like, what should be a very natural, very lush, sort of organic setting. Like they're you know, basically it's a river boat, like they're canoeing down the Danube in this like lush and green wilderness, but they're getting these like forces from outside the order of reality that are starting to they're becoming very hostile to these two guys, and it's just really it is quite interesting what's going on here. It's very internal, and like a lot of the description is just of psychological states and the dynamic between the two characters, how the two kind of like play off each other and like make each other more, and like they almost ramp each other up, and more paranoid, more and more disturbed, seeing things that may or may not be there. And this is another interesting thing. There you get like this kind of like semi-unreliable narrator in the story, where you don't know what's happening. Is it real? Are they hearing these like weird metallic hums, or is it just something they're imagining? And throughout the story, you get these like pieces of evidence, like things that happen where you're like, okay, no, that's real. But the line between reality and, you know, psychological, like dream state or whatever, is kind of blurred. It's a very, very interesting story. There's not many. I could think the only analogs really to something like this are in Lovecraft, I would say. So I thought it was quite interesting. It's not like almost any other book that you're going to read.
Yeah, The Willows, which I love that story, man. It's like it's Gothic in its approach, as it's very atmospheric, and it's about mood and all of these kinds of, about inner turmoil and et cetera, et cetera. However, it takes it to a level that's psychedelic, right? It's no longer like you don't have these concrete mental states where you have to fight against this temptation that's coming for you. You slowly descend into madness. The characters slowly descend into a state where they lose the ability to discern what is real. And it's a dream. I don't even know how to describe it. Like you mentioned, it is a book. It is a story that it's fixed perfectly in between Gothic and Wyrd, and it is almost a genre of its own. It is a beautiful story, very, very cool, and really unnerving and strange, right? I think it's probably one of the best pieces of fiction ever written, and Mr. Lovecraft would agree with me. Now, another analog I would think, when I think of The Willows, I would think of House on the Borderland from William Hope Hodgson. I would put that in there too, right? These are stories that we got to keep in mind. A lot of people, when they think of Bram Stoker, you think of Poe, and you think of Lovecraft. Like if you say those three guys, you think of these guys in completely different eras. Sometimes people they think of them as completely different centuries. These guys are all within like 25 years of one another, right? From the time that Dracula comes out in like, what is it, 1897, from when Lovecraft published his first work, The Alchemist, in 1916. How many years is that? You know what I mean? Was that 20, 21? I'm not good at math, but it's like 20 something years. That's not that long. These guys were within like, a few years of one another. It wasn't centuries separated. These guys were directly informing one another. So it's really hard to separate these genres. And I think that it's not really helpful or meaningful to really truly separate them. We have this like autism now in our brains where we kind of have this instinct to fragment and to define and codify and do all this kind of stuff. Whereas these folks back then, they didn't really see themselves as that. And they probably would look at all of our millions of subgenres of everything that we do and see it as kind of weird and alien. Like, why are you guys even doing this? We're just Gothic. We write Gothic romances, or we're romance writers, or we're XYZ. We write supernatural literature. They probably wouldn't even like the moniker fiction, right? Because they very much viewed what they did to be entwined with truth. They said that we're also speaking truths, right? There's guys that talk about this at length, like Lovecraft wasn't just influential with his storytelling. He was also a tremendous essay writer. He was somebody that wrote a lot. Like if you go and you read his essay, supernatural, was it horror and supernatural literature or whatever, he lays all of this out. He breaks it all down. There's a really good book that it's not really a book. I forget who put it together. It might have been S.T. Joshi. It's really hard to find. I believe it's just called Lovecraft and Nationalism. I have it on PDF somewhere. It's literally just a collection of all of the things he had to say in letters and essays in regards to nationalism. And he kind of gets brushed over as, oh, well, he was just he just hated, the Italians, and he was racist, and blah, 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 blah. And we condemn him. That's just bullshit, right? Lovecraft was a very, very, he had a lot of deep thoughts. He had a lot of big brain takes, you could say, on nationalism and identity and of the politics of the time. And he was very prophetic. He was a very, very influential and underrated political mind as well. These guys were all interwoven. There was not a separation between the nonfiction and the political and the fiction, and all these literature writers were literature writers, and they expressed themselves in many different ways, right? So Poe, for example, was very, very critical. This is something that gets brushed under the rug. Poe was very, very critical of what at the time was called Jeffersonian democracy. He thought it was monstrous, right? He's a guy that willingly enlisted in the military. You know what I mean? He was sort of apolitical in a sense, in a romantic sense, but he was also kind of a nationalist in a way. You know what I mean? This comes through in their works. And this is something that we're talking about in the Gothic, where it has particularism or native preference. It prefers that which is familiar. It has preference for that which is familiar and local, and it views that which has outsideness to be alien and a threat and everything like that. So this is throughout all of literature, leading up into Wyrd and everything like that. And you mentioned, talk about Algernon Blackwood. Wyrd is the kind of upgrade from Gothic, because it takes the Sublime and it brings it to the next level, right? When we talk about weird, we have to go to the etymology of weird, right? When you look at Shakespeare, it's in Wyrd. When we look at Beowulf, Wyrd is in there, W-Y-R-D. It's the same word. And what Wyrd is referencing is the forces of fate, is the immanential processes of reality that order our nature. And what Wyrd literature is doing is it's not subverting that, but it is doing something. It is sidestepping that. It is twisting that. It is doing that to give it effect of a true outsideness that isn't just like a foreigner coming from another land, or like something coming out of the woods, or just like a monster in a faraway castle, but like metaphysical forces that come outside of our reality and that are sublime on the next level. You know what I mean?
Yeah, weird is an interesting concept because it means, in its kind of like primitive acceptation, it means fate. This is what the old England, like the Anglo-Saxons, used that term to mean. But it also, to us now, today, means something bizarre or strange or odd or whatever. And there's an interesting connection here because what weird or fate is basically is something like the natural order or the lawful order of things, how things should be, how things are fated to be, how the norns or the fates in the Greek sort of idiom are ordering things and intending them to be, right? Like this is what fate is. But what is weird, what is bizarre and odd and strange and uncanny, what sticks out is what kind of goes against that natural order of things. When you see something that is just bizarre, that's weird. And it's weird because it calls to mind, it by differing from the natural order of things, it actually sort of reminds you of what that natural order is. What you are fated to be is brought to mind only when something kind of goes wrong. Heidegger makes this point where he gives the example of the hammer, where you don't think about the hammer at all. If you're, a carpenter, you're just using the hammer to drive in nails. You don't think about the hammer. In some sense, becomes transparent. Until something goes wrong with it, like the shaft breaks or like the head flies off or something, and then you're like thinking about it as a hammer instead of just like as a kind of extension of yourself, as a tool or whatever. That's kind of what's going on with weird. Weird, like in WEIRD, is what you get when WYRD kind of goes awry.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway. This is what weird fiction is doing. Weird fiction is reminding you of what the natural order of things are by describing something that violates that natural order. And so, in a sense, yes, it is a total extension of the Gothic, right? Because the Gothic is kind of describing what happens when something kind of goes wrong. Like you get this through like any number of Gothic novels and stories, is that something is just off. You always get this feeling when you read a piece of Gothic fiction or literature. Just from the very start, you can tell that something is off kilter, something is wrong, and it's very interesting. It's just like that we like this, but we do. You could just tell, like from the first paragraph or two, that something has kind of gone wrong, and you kind of trying to figure it out. With some of the best Gothic literature, it is, like as I mentioned before, a kind of it has a lot of crossover with the mystery genre, where you're trying to kind of work out what it is that's going on. But you get this sense that something is just not quite right. And yeah, that's an important part of Gothic literature. Like I'm thinking in particular of The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, but you see this in Dracula, and many, many others as well. So, and that's the lineage, that's the connection between Gothic literature and weird fiction later on.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, the two are like, one is the successor to the other.
Yeah. You also mentioned like mystery. these guys literally, like Machen and Poe, both wrote detective stories. They invented the detective story as well. So many genres came out of this. And also it's important to mention a kind of like variation of Southern Gothic. So Southern Gothic is you know, Poe a lot of times gets mentioned as a Southern Gothic, even though he was sort of in like the weird, like the romantic weird pulp kind of vibe, pre-pulp, I guess you could say. And Robert E. Howard gets thrown in there a lot because he wrote a lot of Southern Gothic. And also you can see the very Gothic influence in his fantasy works as well. It doesn't go away. You look at Lord Dunsany, you know, Gothic is still there. It's but coming to mind with Robert E. Howard is his character Solomon Kane, which would not be out of place in the 1800s, like 30, 40 years before him, 50 years before him. Solomon Kane is a Puritan vampire witch hunter. Now it has the action adventure flavor of his time period, but it is also has all of the aspects of Gothic. It has the dark and spooky swamps. It has voodoo. It has spooky stuff in the bayou, and has the old timey old West architecture and old French architecture, and has these themes of a past, a deep South American past that isn't really it isn't really codified. You kind of don't really know. Did the French build it? The English and the Spanish build it? Who owned this place? Is it some weird Indian shaman blood rite? Is it African voodoo from the dark continent that the slaves brought over, are practicing in secret and sacrificing people? And like and Solomon Kane goes and investigates. But he also has this inner turmoil. He's this character that has to deal with all this kind of stuff, what he did in his life as a pirate. And, you know, it's a lot, you know, it's very, very Gothic. And that's why he a lot of times Howard also gets coined as a Southern Gothic writer. And then you go over to his sword and sorcery stuff, the Gothic is still there. There's still a ton. Conan, when he goes in and he fights these monsters, number one, the evolution of a lot of times the antagonist is some sort of weird like obscure monkey man that evolution left behind. There's these weird ape creatures, the simian humanoids that he has to fight, that are bigger and stronger and faster than your average man, and they want to steal away women, and they're lustful and all of these kinds of things. And he goes to these ancient antediluvian, you know, castles, and there's this long lost period of the far-flung past that is just outside the bounds of living memory, that is still very much alive. And they have these grand cyclopean, you know, architecture, and you know, as mentioned, Cyclopean Lovecraftians, their tales are going to get bushy. But this is another thing. You know, Lovecraft does this the Cyclopean non-Euclidean geometry of the architecture, these long lost places, and you know what I mean. And the mood and the atmosphere and the architecture and the environment is the weather and it's all still there, and it's still very Gothic. So the guys in Wyrd are not that removed. They're still Gothic writers. You could, if you went back in time and you talked to Poe and you talked to Machen and you talked to Lovecraft and you talked to Ambrose Bierce and these guys, they would probably tell you that they are Gothic writers, that they write Gothic stories. So like, this is in the lineage, and it's a beautiful world of writing that I think gets kind of overlooked. You know what I mean? And it was a very important, influential part in the lineage of like modern Western like ideas of nationalism and Romanticism. These guys were all romantics, all of them, 100%. And another part of Gothic literature that stays with the whole thing is a critique of science, a nervousness about technology, right? This idea that science is coming here to mess with our way of life, which for the original Gothics was our religious way of life, and then later on with the Wyrd writers was our way of life in regards to our folk traditions in our communities and all of this kind of stuff. Frankenstein, right? It is called Frankenstein or the new Prometheus, right? It's just the idea of Faustianism going too far. Well, this is the monstrous outcome of science. This is what you have to look forward to. And this bleeds into a lot of sci-fi too. If you take this idea of science too far, this is what you're going to deal with. You go into the Wyrd writers. They very much say, like, yeah, you're little baby science, it can't explain what we're dealing with here. There are things that are far outside the bounds of what you can understand in your puny material reality, and there's nothing you can do about it. It is sublime. It is great. It is cosmic. And then obviously you go into Lovecraft. He said, like, yeah, okay, you want to think in the materialist frame? Well, you don't even want to know what exists in the physical universe. Things that are just insurmountable, sublimity on a level that you can't even fathom, right? So these ideas, this critique of science, this critique of materialism, and people will argue, like, some of these guys were materialists, but they were like self-hating materialists, right? They were romantics, so they were this Odinic force that wanted to oppose a lot of that worldview that was around at the time. Both of the, like, a lot. I'm going on and on, but you can take it from there, Mike.
Yeah. No, there's definitely an ambiguity towards science, a kind of ambivalence where, on the one hand, it's an important part, even of the earlier sort of phase of the Gothic, like with Frankenstein and things like that. But it kind of comes into its own, it gets a little bit stronger later on. But it's always there. There's always this sort of like skepticism about the rational as exhausting the possibilities of reality, as though like the world like is exhausted by propositions. No, there's definitely something more to it than that. There's something that impinges on it from the outside, something that is sublime, something that is just like a brute facticity of being that just stares you in the face, that you just have to reckon with, that is supra rational. Well, not super rational, because that makes it sound like it's ultra rational, but is pre-rational, that is sort of it's at the bottom of all rationality. It's this irrational kernel that needs to be there as a precondition of rationality. You get this feeling in a lot of the Gothic, and it's, what another interesting thing about the Gothic that sort of like leads into weird fiction and Lovecraft and like non-Euclidean hideous, like, mathematics that like just transcends the human mind and all of that, is that you get this stuff in the earlier Gothic literature, but it's kind of interspersed with just a lot of like excellent like literary techniques and just great storytelling, just really good. And a lot of the like Gothic literature, a lot of it is short stories. A lot of it is, it's not these like massive tomes that are just like 7 volumes long of, we all love Tolkien and everything like that. But sometimes, like with this type of genre, I mean, a novella is absolutely sufficient. And there's just some beautiful, beautiful prose writing. I think this is something that kind of deserves to be talked about a little bit more in connection with the Gothic genre, is that some of the writing is just amazing. But it's interspersed with these weird things that just are uncanny and sort of stick out at you, and just like it's the kind of thing that like just reverberates in your memory for like days and days, and like keeps you up at night. Like these little passages, these little turns of phrase that just make you sort of like it kind of turns reality on its head and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interspersed with a lot of like excellent, just good storytelling. And I think what happens a little bit later with the weird fiction authors, like no casting no shade on these guys at all. It's almost like an Arthur Machen or an Algernon Blackwood or a Mary Shelley or a Bram Stoker are kind of like it's this beautiful cake with all this. It's got the nice base to it. It's got the icing and it's all nicely decorated, but you get these cherries on top of the cake that are just these weird things that happen that just kind of stick in your mind or whatever. When you're reading a Lovecraft or somebody like that, it's like it's all cherries and no cake. You know what I mean? This is not to say that he's not a good storyteller or anything like that, but just that like he just dials it up to 11. You know what I mean? He's just like, it's just like one paragraph after another, after another, after another, with this like uncanny shit, this weird shit, this stuff that's like too much for you to handle or whatever. I think this is part of the reason. I mean, this is not a Lovecraft episode. I'm sure we'll do one, but this I think is part of the reason why Lovecraft is kind of like, some people are like he's not a good writer because it's just so much one thing after another of just like uncanny stuff or whatever, whereas it's kind of interspersed a little bit more in like a Blackwood or something like that, although they're leading to that. But the writing is just beautiful, and the word choice and usage, the cadences and everything like that is just, it really is high art. And this is actually something that like Dave and I were talking about before we were just like talking on like back and forth texting or whatever about this, and how it's like, it's just hilarious that like these guys, they're just so much better writers in some sense than what people are like today. It's just hilarious. And I don't know. It's just, it's almost like evidence of like, dysgenics that like you just got so many fucking amazing writers. And it's not even in just the Gothic genre. We could talk about a Herman Melville. We could talk about like, Nathaniel Hawthorne. We could talk about all these like amazing writers in the 19th century whose prose style was just so good, and not just like wordy for the sake of wordy. I read the two books that I read sort of prepping for this episode, The Great God Pan and The Willows by Blackwood, is like, they read well. They're not just like word salad. Like a lot of like, sometimes if you read, especially like philosophy and nonfiction in the 19th century, it's just really stilted and poor writing. But these guys, like, it still reads well, but it's got these beautiful turns of phrase. It's very artistic and everything. I mean, Victorian writing is just so amazing. Really, like reading Origin of Species back in the day and noticing how superior the writing style is of these people was actually one of my first red pills that kind of broke me out of like the progressive notion that like, people are getting smarter, everything's getting better, humanity is just improving. I read this stuff and I was like, no, it's fucking not. I mean, these people are like giants compared to us. You know what I mean? I'm consistently impressed by it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. These guys were just, I mentioned it when we were chatting, it's like reading these, you read The Willows, or you read Great God Pan, or you read, Dracula is very good. He has another book. It's called something Seal of the Seven Stars or something like that. That's like his best. That one's gorgeous. That's how you can describe these works. Poe. These guys that are at the turn of the century or in the 1800s, 19th century, these guys were like classically trained violinists, but in literature. Their stuff was just gorgeous. It was beautiful. It was high art. You know what I mean? And I'm not taking anything away. I love my pulp action adventure guys. I think that stuff, is very good, especially for kids. A lot of stuff was written for kids and written for young adults, young men, right? It was written for teenagers, your Doc Savages and The Shadow and, that stuff, which was exciting. And, these guys were very good writers too. But the the Gothic writers and those who were inspired by the Gothic writers, the Wyrd writers and the supernatural and the folk horror writers in this time period, this 19th century to the early 20th century. These people were artists, and they wrote on a level that you just don't see anymore. This is you can read. I had a book when I was a kid. It was a collection of letters home from Civil War soldiers. These guys were like fucking poets. I mean, they wrote
just writing letters like to their sweetheart or to their family and stuff.
Yeah. It's like, to my dearest beloved Beatrice, how I yearn for your embrace. It's like, dude, like this guy is the equivalent of your just, factory worker today. He was out there in the fields fighting and and he wrote they wrote these beautiful things. And they were just, number one, they were smarter than us. Their education was better. This is a time period that they didn't do college, high school, especially in America. I went to high school at a time where they just kind of like brushed over everything and got you ready for a test so you could get into college, right? It had nothing to do with creating sophisticated minds. And a lot of the minds weren't that sophisticated. I feel that I barely learned anything in high school. I think back and I can barely remember. I'm an autodidact. I've taught myself everything pretty much. I barely learned anything. And these guys went through education in a time period where they had like tutors and Victorian era style curriculums that emphasize philosophy and all of these kinds of things. They were just fucking smart and just great. And this idea that modern and I'm not saying modern writers suck. You guys know me. I'm completely against this idea that we today suck and shouldn't even try. We have to write. We have to continue this tradition because it is a tradition. And I do think that if we took these guys from back then and we showed them what we were doing, they would love it. They would think that they would be impressed by it and all this kind of stuff. But to think that we have moved on from them and that they're lost in time. These guys are immortal giants that we can only strive to be. Like the theme in Gothic that which comes from the past is sublime. They are sublime. Bram Stoker and Horace Walpole and Ambrose Bierce and these Lovecraft, Poe. These guys are the sublime to us, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would not hesitate to say that they were like superior to us, at least in terms of intelligence, at least in terms of learning and education and things like that. And like we certainly have declined, and we've in some ways gotten better because we've undergone such a crucible of we've just like undergone so much hardship, as a folk anyway, if not as individuals. But back then, like in the 19th century, schoolboys would be like exposed to Latin and Greek in like middle school, right? And like the nature of school instruction was totally different, with it like emphasizing rote learning, discipline and obedience and things like that. These people could acquire formidable amounts of learning in a very, very short period of time because of the way that they were educated, and in a way that we can't now, where like today, I mean, back then, by the time you graduated from the equivalent of what is today high school, you would have been expected not only to be able to read Latin, to read Greek, but to be able to converse and debate in Greek. You know what I mean? So this is a completely different sort of order of education. And back then people were just like better able to handle this sort of thing because and we're gonna put out something in the coming months that basically explains this in detail in Imperium Press, because IQ was just higher and it has declined since then. The Flynn effect is what it is it's basically sort of the environmental aspects of intelligence masking a more general decline. So, I mean, the way that these people wrote was amazing, and I think that like contemporary writers really should. I'm not saying that everybody has to write, 200 word long sentences and these page and a half paragraphs and things like that. There is something to. I love my favorite modern writer is Cormac McCarthy, and very often his sentences are something like 7 words long and stuff like that. So I like that stuff too, but it's a different style and everything. But what I'm sort of saying here is that not enough due gets paid to these writers. It sort of seems a little bit quaint and old timey for us, but they were prose masters. They're absolute past masters as prose stylists, and I think that they really deserve a lot more respect than they get today. It just seems weird to us, and in some sense it's because we've declined since then. But here we are in the 21st century, and we're kind of rediscovering a lot of this stuff. This is what Imperium Press is all about. This is what the Bizarre Archives are all about. It's about reviving these old texts. This is what Culture Dads is about. It's about discussing and enshrining the culture that we've had since time immemorial, and talking about how it's still alive today, how it matters today, how we are the heirs of that, how we can live up to that. This is not just sort of like some Hesiodic sighing about, oh, we're not as good as our forefathers. Well, things go in cycles, right? And we are, I really and truly believe that we are on the cusp of a rebirth of something. And the Gothic genre has something to do with that. You can see this in, black metal with its Gothic overtones. You can see that in all manner of literature that's sort of coming out in our scene. You could see that and a lot of the visual art that is coming out of the dissident right and everything like that. This is very much alive and well, and it's in us. And it's being reborn in us, and it's exhilarating to be part of that. This is something that 10 years ago, I would have despaired and just been like, we're all retards now and there's no hope. No, I can see it coming back, and it's exhilarating to see. And it's amazing that the Gothic is, it's something that's very much alive and well today.
Yeah. And here's another thing that needs to be mentioned, and I said it a little bit earlier, but back in the time of the Gothic writers and the Wyrd writers and the Southern Gothic writers and the supernatural writers, there was not this much. And this goes into the early, first half of the 1900s, going to 1950 and 60 and stuff. There was not this big separation between fiction and nonfiction. It wasn't that fiction writers were these nerdy dorks that, wrote this make-believe crap into these gigantic novels and only other nerds read it. And then nonfiction was for degree-holding pencil neck bow ties in departments of universities. And these people commingled. They informed one another. It was it was a very important thing for artists and intellectuals and people of this nature to inform one another. This is where we got Romanticism, for them to inform one another. A guy that comes to mind, Oswald Spengler. Did you read Spengler? A lot of times Spengler's a little long-winded, right? But there's times where he writes in these very beautiful poetic manners. He was very much informed by the art of his day. You know what I mean? You look at, and this comes to mind, man. I've been digging through Nick Land's The Dark Enlightenment that you guys just put out. This guy is informed by art fiction.
Hugely informed by the Gothic genre, for sure.
Hugely informed by Gothic, hugely informed by cosmic horror. In fact, there's times he calls himself a horrorist, right? This is a guy that is informed by this. And this Nick Land guy, I'm just coming into him. He's one of the biggest, I don't know how he's gotten overlooked. this guy is like, there's going to be a time that like people look back on his writing and be like, wow, that was game changing. You know what I mean? And this is kind of the synthesis that occurs when art and I guess you could say nonfiction or philosophical thinking merge together and create this harmony, is where like the greatest shit comes out. And we're really starting. And I know that, Mike, you're making an effort with this. Your like last 3 releases have been art adjacent, right? And you got another one coming out, right? So it's like you are very much getting it. You're now mixing the poetry and the prose, and you released a fiction book. You released Steelstorm, a sci-fi book. You know what I mean? So it's like it's all like coming together, and this is important synthesis that must happen. We can't have this separation anymore. Everybody needs to commingle and inform one another, because when this cycle of informing one another happens, you get truly world-changing things.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up Nick Land, because he's a good example of what I'm talking about with the rebirth of this Gothic thing, and even just the prose style of the 19th century. Like when I first started reading Nick Land many, many years ago, I found it a little difficult because, you know, he is challenging. He is challenging in the same way that, like, you know, reading Darwin is a little bit challenging, or reading, well, fuck, I don't want to say Hegel because that's really challenging. But some of these 19th century writers, it's a step above in terms of the prose style, and you know, not necessarily just in terms of like its quality, but in terms of, you know, the lexical, like the complexity of the sentence structure and the like word choice and usage and things. It's hard to read for people today. And this is not because it's bad writing. It's actually very, very good writing. It's a bit of a challenge for us. So, you know, this is, and also like the intersection in Nick's writing of the aesthetic. So like, you know, the horror elements, the Gothic elements, and all of these things with the technical elements, like the philosophical aspect, because fundamentally he's writing nonfiction, but it's heavily informed by fiction. These things kind of swirling around in this, like, you know, cauldron of influences. This is in a sort of like wider sense what it's going on, you know, with Imperium Press and the scene that we're kind of building around it, where we've got these fiction writers, we've got artists, we've got poets, we've got philosophers, we've got, you know, people who are experts in economics, experts in this and that. Like the scene is really starting to become something. It's starting to really develop a vitality all its own. And it's really cool to see all this kind of happening. So, you know, we're not just about, like, you know, reading history and doing philosophy. We are about those things. That's not something that we like disparage or denigrate. Although I think some people think that I maybe counter-signal a little too much, but we're about other things too. And that's the point, you know, the broader point that I've been making for the last half a year when I'm saying, you know, too much debate and all that stuff. Yes, we need debate, but we also need these other things as well. And it's this aesthetic aspect, especially the Odinic aspect, that you really see come to the forefront in Gothic fiction, in weird fiction, in Romanticism, and the poetry of somebody like, you know, Edgar Allan Poe, or, you know, Coleridge and others like this. You see this dark and striving element that a lot of people call Faustian. You kind of see that, and we are rediscovering that. But we're not just transgressive. We're actually striving towards something that's positive and constructive as well. So, you know, the Gothic element of that, it's an important part of it. And it's also an important part of what it is that we do. I don't know how you can hate the Gothic and hate Gothic things and dark stuff and still be in this scene. It just doesn't make sense to me. So anybody who's not read Machen, anybody that hasn't read Blackwood, anybody that hasn't read, you know, Stoker's Dracula, anybody that hasn't read The Fall of the House of Usher by Poe, you got to get on this, dude. It's fucking amazing.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and I've said this for a long time, that we are like an art art movement in denial, right? It's how do we convey our ideas through images, memes, right? Through little tiny like sayings, right, that become memes. We break everything down to these kind of almost like little poetic little passages, just like meme sayings and slang and things that get it's we have a very artistic flair. And mentioning the Gothic, I can't tell you how many fucking guys love Warhammer 40K. Part of the allure of Warhammer 40K is that it's Gothic as fuck. It really, truly is.
Yeah.
A lot of their spaceships look like Gothic castles. I mean, they have gigantic robots, like giant mech machines that look like Gothic castles, like Gothic architectures throughout the entirety of it. You can't have Warhammer 40K without the Gothic. It's instead of like a dark and stormy night, it is the grim dark of the far future of outer space. You know what I mean? You have the Sublime and the God Emperor of mankind. You know what I mean? It's all throughout that. It's in there. We already love this stuff. It's part of who we are, and part of I think. And going back to Nick Land. Nick Land is another. Just him and as a person. For example, in his book, he rags on what he calls socially autistic, low EQ, rational analysis people, right? He rips these people apart. Even though he's kind of one of them, he rips them apart. He dunks on them throughout like an entire chapter, right? So it's like he has this thing in him where he's also sort of this, he has this desire to go back to what is emotional and romantic, even though he is a very rational, intellectual guy. He, like, for example, I read this one thing, I don't know how true it is, but apparently back in his Marxist days, when he was starting to subvert like the Marxist department in his college, he would just do weird shit to troll people. Apparently he had this like meeting or whatever, was going to give an oration or some sort of
deliver a lecture or something.
Yeah, he was gonna give a lecture, and he like laid on the floor with the microphone in his mouth, like ribbiting like a frog or something. And they flipped out and they hated it. Right? They're like, "We're still fucking Marxists here, you retard." Blah, blah. And he was just like trolling them with this weird like art performance, this like performative weird shit that he was doing. This idea of passion and something that's from the soul that is irrational is in us, and we're like LARPing as these rational, scientific-minded guys. And I just don't think that that's it. You know what I mean? Right now, I'm writing a novella. It's actually kind of off the beaten path of what I usually write. I am writing a mob drama set in the 1980s in Philadelphia. And the reason I'm writing this, there's no swords or magic or aliens or monsters or anything, which is what I almost always write. It is a story about a guy who gets thrusted into this. It's a drama and a romance. And I wanted to write this because I feel that this idea of romance, and I mean romance in like the lowest form, like falling in love, is something that we just think is like gay and we don't want to do it. Blah, 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 blah. When like love between men and women as like a narrative is something that is vital to our existence as human beings. It was vital in the Gothic storytelling, and it is a crucial part of this romantic idea, right? This of Romanticism period. So I wanted to kind of, maybe I'm being a little subversive to what is established to like dissident thought or whatever. But I want to show that men and women falling in love is a beautiful thing, and that it can be cool and entertaining, and it's important, and it can be captivating, and it's an important part of what we have lost in modernity, in post-modernity or hyper-modernity, wherever we're at now. It's like we're at the point that like men don't even want to talk to women. Women are fucking mean. Like you go to the gym and women are just looking for waiting for you to take a glance at them so they could get a video of it and like destroy you online. You got this ridiculous retarded men go their own way where they're saying don't get married, don't have kids. It's completely antenatal. It's like this relationship, this love between men and women is completely lost. And we, even in the dissident sphere, we view it as like, oh, it's like, fuck them. We don't want any of this, anything to do with this. Love is gay, et cetera. When like, you talk about, and Mike, you've talked about this a lot. The motivation of Odysseus is he wants to go home and feel the love of his wife. You know what I mean? He wants to be with his lover, and it's like this stuff is important to the genre and important to our experience as men and as human beings. It's not just falling in love. It's, there's a lot of aspects that are in Gothic literature that make it whole. They give it wholeness. They give it immortality and foreverness that we have like kind of like cooked off. And it's a shame because what's left are like this low EQ, autistic, like stuff that's not artful and not memorable. Nobody's going to remember fucking crime statistics and shit in 100 years. What they will remember are the stories and songs that we write. You know what I mean? That are informed by these ideas in our worldview.
Oh, absolutely. And this is like this is the strength that we bring to the table that many people that came before us didn't, right? Like, I mean, you think about like the meme war of 2015, 2016. How was that undertaken? How was that war waged? Well, it was waged by having good aesthetics, right? That's what memes are. Memes are just these punchy aesthetic sort of things that just get stuck in your mind and that you can't shake or whatever. And this is something that we do really well, that like previous right-wing, the right has always had great aesthetics. And this is something that I talked about, as I mentioned before, with Academic Age and Alexander Adams. We've always had great aesthetics, but there have been times where, right-wing movements have had kind of impoverished aesthetics. On the other hand, you think of something like libertarianism. Libertarianism has basically, all it is now is this rearguard action for wokeness. That's it. But even when it was sort of vital, even like in the Ron Paul days, even in the 1970s and 80s, when it was kind of like, becoming a thing, it just did not have the power to upend the social order like, the alt-right did. And it's not just because they're saying the wrong things and have the wrong beliefs about the world. It's also because libertarian aesthetics are just shitty. This is like one of the things that I hated about it when I was a libertarian. I was always a bad libertarian. I was really more of a social Darwinist, and I just kind of, I didn't like, really cared that much about freedom, although I certainly agreed with don't tread on me and like just like the government shouldn't be telling me like how to do every little thing. That's kind of retarded. But the thing that kind of I was never really able to go all the way, and part of the reason why is that the aesthetics of capitalism are so shitty. Fast forward to the mid 2010s and like the rise of the alt-right and everything like that, and it's a very different story. We are very aesthetically rich. We have a lot of good, interesting things going on, and we're just getting started too. You really get the sense that like the best days lie ahead of us in terms of our aesthetics. As much as great of what's been done already, I really do think that like we've got a lot more to say in this regard. So yeah, very aesthetically strong.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that comes down to the fact that we're kind of punk in some ways, right? Like we will embrace the dark. We will embrace like what is a little bit kind of edgy. Like we're not just sort of like buttoned down, recreating old forms like forever with like no vitality. We're doing something that's genuinely new. We like the dark, we like the weird, we like the edgy, and in some sense, in a very 21st century postmodern way, this is a kind of echo of this Gothic aesthetic that we're drawing on from the Romantic period all the way on. I really do think that the alt-right and the dissonant right is kind of just a continuation of Romanticism itself, and that involves the Gothic, and that's why we like black metal, that's why we like weird shit, that's why we like all this stuff. So it's an important part of who we are.
Exactly. And we talked all about, I went on and on about architecture, dude. How many like meme pages are there that just post like old cathedrals and shit? You know what I mean? We love old medieval architecture and spooky stuff, and we love beauty, but not in a like a modern postmodern sense. We love beauty in a medieval sense. And speaking of, I just had to give another shout out, Lord Dunsany. You wanted to bring up Lord Dunsany, and he doesn't really fall into the Gothic. He's part of the Wyrd. However,
he's another one of those sort of like cut from his own cloth guys. Like these Gods of Pagana are, it's like there's no other book like in its own. It's just a genre unto itself. Sorry, go on.
No, you're absolutely right. He took Gothic, but instead of dark, he made it light and whimsical and ancient, right? It's
and mythical.
Magic and mythical, right? He's got castles and beautiful princesses and weird like fey creatures and wizards and like all this kind of stuff. And he took the Gothic and he shined the sun onto it. He illuminated it. It's the same thing, but it is going in a different direction. It's like Gothic during the daytime. So Dunsany, from that came fantasy. And I want to emphasize this again. This is a discussion that goes on, and you mentioned it, Mike. The idea, and this is big with fantasy, because nowadays when you say fantasy, people go, ugh, because they're thinking some big fucking boring Wheel of Time series or something like that. And, not dunking on Wheel of Time, but yeah, okay, I will. Fuck Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time sucks. All of those books. And, it's like you write 2 good books and then you end up writing fucking 8 gigantic books because you're just trying to sell gigantic books. That's literally all it is. There's tons of fluff and crap. The short story and the novella are king. They are the traditional ways of telling story. They always have been. And despite guys that are trying to emulate Tolkien, and despite the efforts of publishing companies to print books with more pages so they could up the price tag, the bottom line is that writing shorter books and publishing shorter books in terms of fiction is not like contouring to dumb people now with shorter attention spans. It is the tradition, the true traditional format coming back, period.
Yeah, absolutely. And as somebody who is very busy and doesn't have a lot of time to read books and who really wishes he did, I appreciate that very much. I had time to crush these 2 novellas today. Whereas, I didn't have time to go back and reread Dracula. I wanted to reread House on the Borderland. These are not even massive tomes either.
Like 200 pages.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these Gothic novels are very, manageable and everything like that, especially the novellas and things. So, it's excellent. This is the kind of thing where you can sit down, and if you had a whole day, you could probably read one of these books, or maybe in 2 days or something like that. Or if you've got a couple hours a night or an hour a night or something like that, it's not going to take you a year to get through it, right? It's nice. It's punchy. It's condensed. I really appreciate that. So, I can't really say enough good things about the Gothic genre. It's really one of my favorites in terms of fiction.
One book, when we're talking about the Gothic, like leading into the Wyrd, that must be mentioned, in my opinion, is The King in Yellow. Have you ever read The King in Yellow?
I don't know this one. What's that all about?
So The King in Yellow is written by Robert W. Chambers. I forget what year it came out. It's pre-Wyrd. King in Yellow. One second.
I think it's early 20th century, isn't it?
1895. So actually, okay. So this comes out a couple years before Dracula. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So The King in Yellow is is very Gothic, but like the Willows and like some of these other books, it's sort of its own thing. It's very Gothic, and it has the atmosphere. And pretty much the premise of The King in Yellow is The King in Yellow is a play, and the play you don't hear what goes on with the play, right? You don't actually read the play. You only get excerpts from it. And throughout the story, it's a series of like small stories that all connect together of people that read this play and go nuts. And they do weird stuff. And it's brilliant. The King in Yellow is one of the most important books ever written. Beautiful, gorgeous, incredible story. Very Gothic, very supernatural. And it kind of it fits nicely at the end of the Gothic period, but it is like its own thing. So The King in Yellow, we should just Archive should just publish it because it's public domain.
Yeah, absolutely, man. No, I've heard of it. Its reputation precedes it, and maybe I got to check it out. Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. If you publish it, I would love to pick that up.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right. Well, we are on 2 hours. We just hit 2 hours. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about, Mr. Mike? You want to start wrapping it up?
Yeah, I think we hit all the main points. Gothic is an amazing genre, and it was great to go back because this was kind of like a blast from the past for me. I mean, I really went through about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, I really went through a period where I was like just crushing all these like Gothic fiction, like 19th century, early 20th century Gothic fiction books. And it was great to go back to that because there's just so much good stuff there. There's such great writers. Yeah. Anybody who is listening that hasn't read any of these, it's really like you got to put it near the top of your list.
Yeah, absolutely. And support the guys that are writing Gothic stuff now. Archives has a book coming out that fits pretty nicely into the Gothic weird kind of vibe.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But it's called the Horror Beneath. It's in 1978 England, and there is an ancient, not an ancient, but an old mansion. It's all centered. Speaking of architecture, centered around this weird old mansion that has this checkered past, and weird supernatural shit happens, and cosmic horror shit happens, and it's really, really a good book, and that's gonna drop any day now. So guys, check that out, and check out Blood, Soil, and Paint, coming out from Imperium Press, coming out very soon. If you're listening right now, it means you're already signed up. But if you're not, make sure to go to imperiumpress.org/podcast and go sign up and get Culture Dads every single week. We're dropping episodes every week now. So go sign up to the Gumroad and get perks like hardback books and help support Imperium Press grow into the institution that they were destined to be. But anyways, like always, I'll see you guys next time here on Culture Dad's Age of Sword Cassette.